You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Nathalie Gontier. She's the author of Reticulate Evolution. She's the director of Applied Evolutionary Epistemology Lab, the Center for Philosophy of Science, Department of History and Philosophy of Science, Faculty of Science at University of Lisbon, Portugal. So, Nathalie, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, good. Well, tell me about your work. What does your research involve?
So I am a philosopher of science. I'm a philosopher of science, and I also studied comparative science of cultures, which is cultural anthropology. And so my main focus is on evolution, how biologists, but also people active in social-cultural evolution, so anthropologists, archaeologists, and linguists, how they define evolution. And so evolutionary epistemology, the lab that I run, and also the name that it has, evolutionary epistemology is a discipline within philosophy of science and also within theoretical biology that investigates the structure, the formal structure of evolutionary. And so that is what evolutionary epistemology is, and that is what we do at our lab at this moment in time. We are looking into different mechanisms and processes of evolution that extend the modern synthesis and the NeoDarwinian paradigm, and we are looking into how they are defined, how they define units and levels of evolution and mechanisms, and how they can be implemented not only within the biological sciences, but also to study aspects of language and culture and other aspects in the humanities.
So, as I understand it, I may be wrong, the neo-Darwinists say that evolution is caused by random mutation and natural selection acting upon it. But what is the extension you're talking about? What have you found that you think would extend the theory or change it?
Yeah, so the cosmology, in a way, that the Neo-Darwinian synthesis endorses is they look into how organisms evolve in the environment by means of natural selection. So they take as a given that the mechanism by which evolution occurs is natural selection, and they take as focal point of research the organism. And then in the 70s, so this is the modern synthesis. I'm talking about the 1930s and the 1940s when it was founded. And following Darwin, people there are still focused on the organism. But around the 70s, with, for example, the introduction of Richard Dawkins' book on the selfish gene, he said that the true unit of natural selection is not the organism, but it are the genes that reside inside them. And so what we got here was a first shift from the organism to other entities in the world, in this case genes, that were considered to be units of natural selection. And on the other hand, a couple of years later, you had, for example, in macroevolution, the work of Stephen G. Gould and Niles Eldredge, when they introduced punctuated equilibria, that demonstrates that evolution can go faster than predicted by natural selection or by classical Darwinian theory. They said, well, perhaps there is a way in which we can understand that there is some kind of species sorting. They didn't really use the term species selection, but they used the term of species sorting. So what happened was that new units of evolution were being introduced. So at this moment in time, people, for example, examine how what the role is of the cells or of organs that we use during development, how they can somehow impact evolution. So in that regard, the classic NeoDarwinian synthesis, they thought about this very strict hierarchy going from organisms in their environments and evolving by natural selection. While today we recognize that there are many different evolutionary mechanisms. So, for example, the most important group of mechanisms that are being more and more recognized for their importance is reticulate evolution. So reticulate evolution is evolution as it occurs by means of symbiosis, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer, hybridization, and what that demonstrates is that instead of the pattern, natural selection gives a pattern of descent with modification. So you have to go from one generation to the other generation. In the case of reticulate evolution, what we see is that information is being exchanged very freely without sexual reproduction between organisms of different species, between organisms that even belong to different kingdoms. And
when you say information is being exchanged, what do you mean? What kind of information? Are you saying genes are being exchanged, or just information like, oh, I see a butterfly flying around, so that tells me something?
Well, horizontal gene transfer or infectious heredity, for example, is a good example of how information can be exchanged. Basically, in winter, we catch the flu from the people around us that have the flu. And so what happens is that they just pass on the virus. So in this regard, the information that is being exchanged is a complete virus. And then that virus will copy its DNA, its genes into our DNA. And so that virus is able to reproduce inside of us by making use of our cellular equipment. So this is a form of horizontal transfer of information exchange when there is the passing on from a virus from one organism to the other. But information can also be passed on, like, horizontally when we think about learning. When you think about a high school situation where a teacher provides information to the students, that's a form of horizontal transfer of information as well. So in that regard, one of the things that associates with the extension of the modern synthesis is that we are starting to rethink information. We are starting to rethink patterns of evolution. We are starting to rethink mechanisms of evolution.
Well, so when someone shares information with me, like a teacher, okay, it gives me, mental information. It may change the way I live. Maybe it'll change my epigenetics. Maybe it'll cause me to, to take up smoking or to do some other activity, exercise more. That epigenetically changes me. But what about my underlying DNA? Besides infecting me with like an endogenous retrovirus that integrates itself into my DNA, how could I be changed maybe at the DNA level by the exchange of information?
Well, that is one of the things that is being studied these days within epigenetics and within Evo. So again, the NeoDarwinian synthesis thought that information flow went from genes to organisms to species, and the organism in a way was passively selected. The organism had a passive. The organism was passive inside the environment, and the environment was the one that did the selecting of the organism based upon whether or not it was adaptive to that environment. So in that regard, an organism was passive insofar as genes, for example, genetic mutations were understood to be the result of random mutations. an organism cannot influence what kind of genes it has, and so once it is there, it will be the organism in the environment. It will be the environment that naturally selects that organism or not. So in that regard, it was very passive. But today we are looking into information flow in the opposite direction. So we are looking into how an organism can change its genes, and how the environment can influence how organisms evolve. And so in that regard, there is a lot of research being done within epigenetics and within Evodevo on how the activation that exists of our genome. So not all our genes are active all the time. So genes are switched on and off all the time. And depending upon the environment, some genes are becoming more active, other genes are being switched off. And so this is something that can sometimes be passed on to the next generation. So this is a form of epigenetics. We know, for example, that there has been research done on that people that are descendants of the Holocaust have a different. You see it in the genome, and it is the consequence of what happened in the lifetime of these individuals and their parents that made them have these changes in their genome. That's just to give you one example.
What's interesting. Yeah, what's interesting is for the most part, I guess we're looking for heritable adaptation. The epigenetics kind of, it seems like that's what it is in part. Supposedly most of epigenetic changes are wiped out, during zygote formation or during the sperm and the egg meeting and turning into a zygote. But some are preserved. They must be, because of things like you mentioned, the Dutch starvation, that kind of stuff. I don't know. I guess my question is, when does speciation occur and why? Is it just a preponderance of changes to the point where, I don't know, reproductive isolation makes a new species and that's more fit for the environment? Does that have to happen? I guess it's a really tough question, I guess. But, again, what causes speciation based on what you know?
Well, speciation is something that can be caused by many different ways. So there also, Darwin thought that and this is something that Niles Eldredge was very able to capture the way that he said that. The idea with the NeoDarwinian synthesis and with Darwin is that organisms, that species will evolve themselves out of existence. So that means that, over time it is inevitable that mutations will occur. There will be random variations. There will be selection of certain individuals over others. And so it is inevitable in a way, if you look into the paradigm, that new species will evolve, that there will be a differentiation, and that most species evolve then by splitting. So if you think about, for example, the tree of life, the idea is that new branches emerge because they split off from existing branches. So a species evolves by splitting off from another species, because they become, over time, they just become too different. But this is not always the case. For example, there are species that appear to be living fossils, and that is a term that is used to refer to organisms that just do not seem. Species are there, and then they are morphologically similar to the species when they were first evolving, sometimes a million years ago. Examples of that are, for example, Scorpio is the stars, the scorpion, the animal, the scorpion is a living fossil. It does not seem to evolve much morphologically. If you compare a present scorpion or when we find the first fossils in the fossil record, there does not seem to be much change. So that idea that a species will naturally evolve itself out of existence into another species is not always the case. Another thing is that species do not only evolve by speciation, by splitting off from the tree of life. Symbiosis, symbiogenesis has demonstrated that sometimes evolution and the evolution of a new species occurs because there is a merger of lineages, or because there is horizontal transfer between lineages. Sometimes hybridization leads to speciation. It leads to the introduction of a new species. So in that regard, why do species evolve? and how, that is a question that requires more than one answer.
Okay. So since you're looking at the cultural side a little bit and the anthropological side, what does that tell you that it may not tell other scientists? Like, what unique things are you discovering, you believe?
Well, one of the things that I think that especially the sociocultural and the linguistic sciences are demonstrating is that you can show that everything evolves. For many years in the biological sciences, people have thought very strongly about what the true unit of natural selection is, not even of evolution, but of natural selection. And so some people thought it was the genes, other people thought it was the organism, and this has divided for many years, many different disciplines. While if you look into the sociocultural science and the linguistic sciences, there people are making phylogenies, so tree models and network models on how different elements of culture evolve. So they look into variation and evolution of tools. They look into changes in textual analysis, how writing changes over time, how cultural artifacts change over time, how ideas change over time. And you can basically demonstrate that most ideas that we have on evolution about descent with modification or reticulation, these patterns, they are there, and we can talk about these in terms of evolution. We can use evolutionary jargon to talk about language, how they change over time. That is a form of evolution. How cultures change over time is a form of evolution. And there we see that there are many different units of cultural and social evolution. Skateboard decks, the television, the automobile. So examples of material culture, we can demonstrate that they evolve over time.
So any interesting phenomena that you're focusing on? Any particular evolutions of phenomena that really captivate your attention?
So at the moment, I'm very interested in language evolution, and we just recently, last week, had here the reiteration, the 60th reiteration of proto-language. So I'm in the permanent board of a group of people investigating proto-language, and proto-language is a language that we define as an intermediate communication system between, on the one hand, ape communication systems, and on the other hand, modern human language. So the idea is that language evolved from ape communication systems, but that there must be intermediate steps, and so we try to define those, and also ask the question, who had language? Did the Neanderthal, for example? And so we had here in Lisbon, in Portugal, at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, a conference where we had around 180 people in passing, discussing archaeology, anthropology, primatology, to investigate, how do you define communication, how do you model communication, also a lot of people working in artificial intelligence. And so my interest at this moment is very much caught up in language in that regard.
Okay. So what do you believe? I mean, I don't know. Are there any imminent breakthroughs you believe, or big changes coming to how people think about evolution?
Yes. So I think in general we are moving towards a form of pluralism, a form of what they call in philosophical jargon a form of epistemic or epistemological pluralism, which means that we recognize that there are different mechanisms out there, that there are different mechanisms and different processes. And so the big question today is not the fights that there were, for example, with people adhering to microevolution or microevolution or mesoevolution. The question is, how do we conceptualize this plurality of mechanisms? How do we conceptualize that evolution can at one point go slow and at another point go fast, at one point goes randomly, at one point it is directed, and at one point evolution is vertical and at another point it is horizontal. And so this requires us to come to terms with an enormous amount of complexity, and we need to think about how can we model this complexity. And one way, for example, that is one thing that is interesting in that regard is that in general, in all these different sciences, biological, social, cultural, linguistic, people are moving away from tree of life typology, and they are introducing networks to demonstrate the multiple ways in which different entities often interact. And so this is something that in that regard I'm studying. So my idea there would be, we are moving towards pluralism, and we are also moving towards a different way of modeling complexity, and that happens through networks.
What do you mean that happens through networks? What would be an example of how this would work?
Well, so if you look at classical Darwinian thinking again, so the idea that speciation occurred by splitting off by a branch that splits into branches, right? So you have a ramification in the tree of life. Today, when we look into how a virus penetrates one organism, so how a virus produced by, how a virus, for example, so the flu, you get the flu, viral particles within you are multiplying. When you cough, these viral particles are going, they are coming into the air, in the airstream, and so a person next to you breathes in parts of these viruses that come from your breath, and they become infected by the flu because of it. This is a form of horizontal transfer, and this is something that we know that well, we used to think that this was only something that influences on touching and development, because most viruses, they do not infect the sex cells, and so the idea was that this cannot be transferred from one generation to the next. So what happened during your lifetime was of no influence. But today we know that that is not always the case, that some viruses somehow make their way into the germline, and so they can be transmitted not only horizontally but also vertically. Now, if you want to model something like that, you cannot do that within the tree of life. You have to start drawing connections in different ways. Also, if you investigate not only how genes bring forth organisms and how they bring forth species, but how a gene of one organism induces a change in an organism belonging to another species, you have to start drawing networks. It's very natural, as soon as you start thinking about it, you start to draw a network. And so that annihilates the possibility of in those connections, to look at that from within a tree of life.
So, okay, so networks are what cause all these various transfers of information and, genes and other types of materials. So it's the network itself that's really behind evolution. Is that the premise?
That is something else. So on the one hand, we see that scientists are understanding evolution better by drawing networks instead of trees of life. Now, of course, does that imply that evolution is itself a network? Well, I don't know if that is if there is a 1-1 isomorphy or a 1-1 correspondence there. I do not know, but it is a very intriguing thing to think about. Perhaps, yes, evolution by itself is a network-like process. It's possible, yes. That is a very interesting question that one does not follow from the other, but it's something that might be worthwhile to look into, yes.
Okay.
So the question of
all right.
if we not, yes.
Well, okay. So what about backtracking now? Do you feel like you have any different insight on how life might have began?
Well,
I know it's an easy question. I'm just teasing you, but why not ask it?
Yeah, there are multiple theories also about how life evolved, and there are also again, it becomes obvious more and more the role that has been played by symbiogenesis. So we know that if we look into the origin of the eukaryotic cell, which is the cell with the nucleus and often also with organelles, with tiny bodies within that cell, we know that those are the result of symbiotic merger. So at one point we had a cell with genes inside, and the development of the nucleus. Some people already say that that was a symbiogenetic event. Other people deny that. But regardless, eukaryotic cells often have organelles, and these organelles are tiny bodies within these cells. And we know these organelles descend from bacteria. So at one point, bacteria must have invaded these primary cells, and they have evolved into these cell bodies, and that is the process of symbiogenesis. We know, for example, that mitochondria evolved from purple bacteria, and we also know that cyanobacteria evolved into the chloroplasts that we find in plant cells, and which enables a plant to have its color, most of the time green. And so we know that those organelles used to be free living bacteria.
Do you think that all the organelles were a result of symbiogenesis? I know the mitochondria is reputed to be, but again, do you think that other organelles, like the ribosomes, the Golgi apparatus, etc., do you think they're all instances of symbiogenesis?
No, it is not something that can be, per definition, said that all organelles have evolved by symbiogenesis. Most certainly not. But it is demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt through genetic comparisons that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts are the result of bacterial merging.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know if there's any evidence at all or thought that other organelles came from symbiogenesis.
The evidence is there. So at this moment in time, a couple of years ago, people compared the genes present in mitochondria and in free-living bacteria that are alive today, that are the descendants of these purple bacteria. And up until this day, the genes are very, they resemble each other a lot. So it is beyond reasonable doubt, because they resemble each other that much that it is unlikely, impossible, statistically speaking, that they come from anywhere else.
Okay, yeah, I just wondered. I thought maybe because the mitochondria has genes in it that they thought, oh, well, that must have come from a bacteria. But since maybe the ribosome doesn't appear to have any genes in it, then no. It seems like that was the reasoning behind why people are convinced that the mitochondria, again, it's a symbiogenic event, but other organelles no.
Well, the chloroplast is certain. At one point, people looked into lysosomes perhaps being of bacterial descent. These are questions, but there it was not at all obvious whether that was the case or not. But it is something that is not really investigated further these days. So, but yeah.
Okay. Well, again, I just wondered. So interesting.
Yeah.
So, but any insights do you feel like you have any unique insights on how life might have began based on your work and your research, or is it just like no one knows?
Well, I wrote a book on theories on the origin of life, but I wouldn't say that I developed my own theory on that. What I have done more in my career is I have looked into this formal structure of evolution. And so for a long time, evolution has been defined based upon natural selection. So it was evolution is that what evolves by means of natural selection. And one of the things that I have been thinking about is a new way of defining evolution that is neutral enough to include these different kinds of evolutionary mechanisms that are out there. And in that regard, I define evolution as the phenomenon whereby units evolve at levels of an ontological hierarchy by mechanisms and processes. And that is a lot to say that beyond genes, beyond organisms, there can be different units of evolution. So a unit of evolution can be a gene, it can be an organism, it can also an organelle, it can be a bacterium. If we look into these events of symbiosis, so there can be many units. This is a way of accepting that pluralism of units. Another, so units evolve at levels, and there also the level you see the environment. But the environment has also been redefined in many ways. So when Darwin was talking about selection, for him that occurred in the external environment. So nature, in a way, as we would have called it. But today we know that selection often also occurs inside the organism. And Lewontin, for example, he called it the internalization of selection. So we know that genes are switched on and off. So that in itself is a selection process that happens within the genome. During, for example, the transcription and translation, there is a selection of certain genes. We also know that when organs are formed, that is a form of a selection process. Also, if you look at immunology, that is a form of a selection process. So in that regard, people have introduced the concept of multi-level selection. And so people have also been looking into how one gene, for example, can evolve at the level of the organism, at the level of the brain, at the level of an organ, at the level of the genome itself. And in that regard, there also I have even broadened that idea further by recognizing that a level, well, there are multiple levels, but it is not only multi-level selection theory that we have to apply there. We also need to look to how levels associate with symbiosis theory. In that regard, for example, people look into how an organism plus its microbiome and plus its viriome becomes a new biological and that entity, for example, is the holobiont, and the holobiont is not only a new biological individual, it is also a new habitable zone of life. It forms a new environment, it forms a new ecology. So in that regard, we also need to come to terms with the pluralism that there is of level. So evolution is when units evolve at certain levels, and then within an ontological hierarchy, and this is the question, we need to, when we accept pluralism of units and levels, we need to think about the structure in which these bring forth the reality that is out there. And in that regard, I think in that regard that we are moving towards a form of network typology to understand evolution, and that this hierarchy is network-like. So in that regard, evolution is units that evolve at levels of an ontological hierarchy, and then by mechanisms and processes. And these mechanisms and processes are beyond natural selection, also symbiosis, symbiogenesis, also genetic drift, mechanisms of epigenetics, of evo-devo. And so my contribution in that field is looking for the formal structure, which is this new definition of evolution.
Okay. So for listeners, what's a way for them to, I don't know, start understanding the complexity? Because it just seems, insanely complex, everything that's going on, and how to grasp it. So, what are some suggestions for people that, again, they're somewhat new to evolutionary biology, and, how do they start?
Well, I think people need to read a lot of books, and in that regard, like, make the selection to not only look for books that explain life by means of natural selection, but to look for books on symbiosis and symbiogenesis, on virology. There are a lot of popular books being written on that, on the tree of life, on the network of life. And so that is, I think, a way to get more knowledge about that. In this regard, also, I am part of a community which is called the Third Way of Evolution. And the Third Way of Evolution is a group of biologists, but also people from outside of biology, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, virology, botany, that are we are not satisfied with how NeoDarwinian theory continues to dominate the scientific paradigm and the ideas of evolution, how they portray these ideas with the media, how they publish books that are in many ways outdated because or they just do not take certain parts of evolutionary research into account. They dominate funding, and we don't like that. And in that regard, I'm part of this group of the Third Way of Evolution, which is an initiative by Dennis Noble and James Shapiro and Raju, and they have made this website that is a collective of books and articles where people can start looking this new biology that is evolving.
Okay, very good. And where can people find your specific papers and research and your thoughts? What's a good way for them to get in contact?
I have my own lab that has a website with fields, so the Applied Evolutionary Epistemology Lab, which is at the Center for Philosophy of Science. And then all my papers are on Academia Edu, so if people just Google my name, then they find my webpage, and then my papers are there.
Okay.
And also,
very good.
If people are interested in Protolanguage, we have a website on Protolanguage. And also, I am the series editor of the Springer Nature book series, Interdisciplinary Evolution Research. And we have made some very interesting books on macroevolution, We had a thematic volume on macroevolution. We had a thematic volume on reticulate evolution. We had one on primate cognition, and we had one on language and communication. So if people are interested, I would suggest to have a look there.
Well, very good. Well, Natalie, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was a pleasure talking with you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.